The retirement papers sat unsigned on our kitchen table for 19 days. They were impossible to ignore. 6 pages of neatly printed forms, a yellow sticky note marking every place Martin needed to initial, and a blue folder from the neurologist resting beside them like an explanation neither of us wanted to say aloud. Every morning, I moved the papers aside so we could eat breakfast. Every evening, I placed them back in the center of the table, hoping their presence would eventually force the conversation he kept avoiding. On the 19th morning, I finally slid a pen across the table toward him. Martin looked at it. Then he looked at me. His right hand was resting beside his coffee cup, the fingers trembling almost too slightly for anyone who did not know him well to notice. I noticed. I had noticed every tremor since the first one appeared 6 months earlier. "Sign them," I said. He did not reach for the pen. "Carolyn, your doctor told you to reduce your workload. He told me I could continue working if I was careful. He also told you that exhaustion makes the symptoms worse." I know what he told me. Then why are we still having this conversation? Martin lowered his eyes toward the retirement packet. For nearly 37 years, he had taught English at Bellwether High School. He had spent more of his life inside that building than anywhere except the house we shared. I understood that leaving would hurt. I understood that retirement was not simply the end of a job for him. It was the closing of classrooms, the final emptying of a desk, the last time a student would call his name from the hallway. But I also understood what I had watched happen during the previous months. I had watched him struggle with the buttons on his shirt. I had watched him pause at the bottom of our stairs before beginning the climb, as though his body needed extra time to remember an instruction it had followed effortlessly for decades. I had watched him grip the kitchen counter after standing too quickly. And I had sat beside him in a neurologist's office while a kind, careful doctor explained that the tremor, stiffness, and subtle changes in his movement were consistent with early-stage Parkinson's disease. Martin was 64 years old. We had enough savings, his pension was secure, our mortgage had been paid off for almost 5 years. There was no financial reason for him to continue standing in front of a classroom every weekday morning. That was why his refusal frightened me. It suggested there was a reason I did not know. He looked up at me again, and I saw the same quiet resistance I had been living with since the diagnosis. "I can't retire yet," he said. "Why?" "I just can't." "That is not an answer." "I know." "Then give me one." He was silent for so long that the coffee between us stopped steaming. Finally, he folded the retirement papers, placed them back inside the folder, and pushed them toward the far end of the table. "I need to finish the school year." It was October. The school year had barely begun. "Why this year?" I asked. "What is different about this year?" Martin's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened. His eyes shifted away from mine. "There is something I need to see through." "What?" He stood slowly, using the edge of the table for balance. "I'm going to be late." Then he carried his coffee to the sink, left the unsigned papers behind, and walked out of the kitchen. "Hello. My name is Caroline, and this is the story of the 8 months I spent believing my husband's refusal to retire was about fear, pride, or a secret he had never trusted me enough to share. It is also the story of a boy named Eli, a woman I had never met, and a promise Martin had made years before the diagnosis changed the shape of our future. This is not a story about money, though for a while I was convinced it had to be. It is not a story about a man who loved his job more than his wife, though there were mornings when that was exactly how his refusal felt. And it is not, in the end, a story about Parkinson's disease. It is a story about what it means to remain when every reasonable argument tells you to leave, and about the quiet damage that can occur when a person mistakes carrying a promise alone for keeping it faithfully. Martin and I had been married for 33 years by the time the tremor appeared. We met when I was 27, and he was 31, at a retirement dinner for a teacher neither of us knew particularly well. I was there because the retiring teacher was my aunt's neighbor. Martin was there because the teacher had been his department chair during his first year at Bellwether High. I remember noticing him before we were introduced because he was the only person in the room listening more than he spoke. Whenever someone told a story, Martin leaned slightly forward, as though the next sentence genuinely mattered to him. He did not scan the room while other people talked. He did not wait impatiently for his turn. He simply paid attention. That quality remained one of the most defining parts of him throughout our marriage. Martin remembered things. Not only birthdays, appointments, and the names of people's children. He remembered the small details most people let slip away. He remembered that my mother disliked lilies because their scent reminded her of hospitals. He remembered that our oldest daughter had once mentioned, at age 9, that she wanted a telescope, and he bought her one 2 Christmases later when we could finally afford it. He remembered which students hated reading aloud, which ones pretended not to care about grades because disappointment felt safer that way, and which ones lingered after class because home was not somewhere they were eager to return to. Over the years, I sometimes joked that Martin carried hundreds of people inside his head. I never understood how literally true that was until much later. Our marriage was not perfect, but it was steady. We raised 2 daughters, Emily and Kate, in the same modest brick house we still lived in when this story began. We attended school plays, endured orthodontic appointments, argued about screen time, celebrated college acceptances, and eventually watched both girls build lives of their own. Martin taught through all of it. Every weekday morning he left the house at 6:45 with a travel mug in one hand and a worn leather briefcase in the other. The briefcase had been a gift from me on our 5th anniversary. By the time of his diagnosis, the corners had softened and the handle had been repaired twice, but he refused to replace it. "It already knows where everything goes," he would say. For most of our marriage, I admired the consistency of his work. He was not one of those inspirational teachers who gave dramatic speeches in films or transformed entire schools through a single heroic act. His devotion was quieter. He stayed after class. He wrote careful comments in the margins of essays. He kept granola bars in his desk for students who arrived hungry. He attended graduations long after the students crossing the stage had left his classroom. Every June, former students mailed him announcements, photographs, wedding invitations, and occasionally letters explaining how a book he had assigned or a conversation he had barely remembered had changed something in their lives. I knew he mattered to people. I also knew that by 64 he was tired. Before the diagnosis, we had already discussed retirement. We talked about traveling through New England in the fall. We talked about renting a small house near the coast for a month each summer. Martin said he might volunteer at the public library or tutor adults preparing for equivalency exams. The plan had been clear. He would finish one final school year, retire the following June, and begin a slower chapter of life with me. Then his right thumb began to tremble. At first, the movement was so slight that he dismissed it as too much coffee. When it continued, he blamed stress. When I noticed that his right arm no longer swung naturally while he walked, he told me I was watching him too closely. The first time he dropped a stack of dinner plates, he laughed. The second time he dropped something, neither of us did. Our family doctor referred him to a neurologist. The weeks between that referral and the appointment felt longer than they actually were. Martin continued teaching. I continued searching for explanations late at night and closing every web page before he entered the room. The neurologist performed a series of tests that seemed almost insultingly simple compared with the weight of what they might reveal. He asked Martin to tap his fingers, walk across the room, turn, write a sentence, and touch his thumb to each fingertip. Then he asked questions about stiffness, sleep, balance, and whether Martin's handwriting had become smaller. It had. The diagnosis arrived carefully. Early-stage Parkinson's disease. Not a prediction of immediate decline. Not the end of independence. Not a command to stop living. The doctor explained that symptoms and progression varied greatly. Medication, exercise, physical therapy, and careful monitoring could help Martin remain active for years. He encouraged him to stay engaged, but also warned that stress, fatigue, and the physical demands of full-time teaching might become increasingly difficult. I heard permission to retire. Martin heard permission to continue. In the parking lot after the appointment, I cried. Martin did not. He sat behind the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, the keys resting in his trembling hand. "We are going to manage this," I told him. He nodded. "You are not alone." He nodded again. "We will call the retirement office tomorrow." That was the first time he looked at me. "No." I thought he was in shock. "We don't have to make any decisions today." "I already made mine." "You were planning to retire. Next year." "Martin, the doctor just told you." "He told me I can work. He told you to pay attention to your limits." "I am paying attention. You can barely sleep after a normal school day." "I said I am not retiring." The force in his voice startled me. Martin rarely raised it. He did not raise it then, exactly, but the words arrived with a hardness that made me stop speaking. He drove us home in silence. For the first few weeks, I tried to be patient. A diagnosis can make reasonable people react irrationally. I assumed Martin needed time to grieve the future he had imagined. Teaching had given structure to his life for nearly 4 decades. Perhaps retiring immediately would feel like surrendering to an illness that had barely begun to affect him. I told myself he would reconsider once the first shock passed. Instead, he became more determined. He woke earlier. He arrived at school before nearly everyone else. He stayed late 2 or 3 afternoons a week, sometimes returning home after 7 with the exhaustion carved visibly into his face. When I asked why, he mentioned committee meetings, tutoring sessions, or unfinished grading. The explanations were plausible. The pattern was not. Martin had always taken his work seriously, but he had never treated every school day as though something irreversible depended on his presence. By November, the medication had reduced the tremor slightly, but the stiffness was worse in the mornings. I began helping him with small tasks he insisted he did not need help with. I buttoned his cuffs while pretending to straighten them. I placed his travel mug near his left hand because his right grip remained less reliable. I moved the heavy cast iron pan from the lower cupboard so he would not have to lift it awkwardly. He noticed every accommodation and acknowledged none of them. One Tuesday evening, he came home nearly 2 hours late. His shirt collar was open, his tie had been stuffed into his coat pocket. There was chalk dust on one sleeve and something darker beneath his eyes than ordinary fatigue. "Faculty meeting?" I asked. He hesitated. "Tutoring. Which student?" "Caroline." "It is a simple question. A senior who needs help." "With what?" "English." "You teach English, I gathered that much." He placed his briefcase on the floor more carefully than usual. "I don't discuss students' private situations. I am not asking for private information. I am asking why my husband, who was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, is staying at school until after dark. He needs help, and you are the only teacher capable of giving it." Martin took off his coat. He asked me. Something in the way he said it made the answer feel larger than the question. "Who is he?" Martin looked toward the hallway. "A student." "That is not what I asked. It is all I can tell you." The following morning, I found a handwritten note inside his briefcase. I was not searching for it. That is what I told myself then, and it was mostly true. Martin had left his medication on the kitchen counter, and I slipped the bottle into the front pocket of his briefcase before he left for work. As I did, a folded piece of lined paper fell onto the floor. I picked it up. The page had been torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was young, uneven, and pressed so hard into the paper that some letters had nearly broken through. "Mr. Hayes, I know you keep saying you're not leaving, but people always say that before they do. You don't have to keep helping me just because of what you promised her. I'm used to figuring things out. Eli." I read the note twice, then a third time. The sentence that stayed with me was not the one about Martin leaving. It was the reference to a promise. "Just because of what you promised her." I heard the front door open behind me. Martin had returned for his glasses. He stopped when he saw the paper in my hand. For several seconds, neither of us moved. "Who is Eli?" I asked. Martin closed the door slowly. "A student." "Who is she?" His face changed. It was not guilt exactly. I know that now. At the time, it looked close enough. "Give me the note." "Who did you make a promise to?" "Carolyn." "You refused to retire. You stay at school until dark. A student says you promised some woman you would not leave him. What am I supposed to think?" Martin took a step toward me. His right foot dragged slightly across the floor. The sound made my anger collide abruptly with concern, but it did not erase it. "You are supposed to trust me," he said. "I have trusted you for 33 years. Then trust me now." Trust is not the same as silence. "I know. Do you?" He looked exhausted. Not defensive. Not angry. Simply tired in a way that seemed to reach far beyond the diagnosis. "I will explain," he said. "When?" "When I can. You have been saying that for months." "It is not entirely my story." "Then tell me the part that is yours." He held out his hand for the note. I did not give it to him immediately. "Is Eli your son?" The question left my mouth before I had decided to ask it. Martin's eyes widened. "No." "Are you certain?" "Of course I'm certain." "Did you have a relationship with his mother?" "No." "Then why does he believe you owe her something?" Martin lowered his hand. "Because I do." I felt the room change around us. Who was she? He looked down at the floor. Her name was Marissa. The name meant nothing to me. That made it worse. Was? Martin closed his eyes briefly. "She died." I waited. He offered nothing else. "How long ago?" 3 years. "How did you know her?" "She was a student." "When?" "A long time ago." "And you made a promise to her about her son?" "Yes." What promise? Martin's gaze moved toward the paper in my hand. That I would not leave before he did. I thought of the unsigned retirement forms. Before he did. Before Eli graduated. The explanation should have relieved me. Instead, it created 100 new questions. Why would a former student ask you for something like that? Martin's voice softened. Because she knew what it felt like when adults left. Then he took the note gently from my hand, placed his glasses inside the briefcase, and walked out the door. For the rest of that day, I could think about little else. Marissa. Eli. A promise made 3 years earlier. Martin had known about this obligation long before his diagnosis. Perhaps that explained why the retirement plan had always remained strangely vague whenever I asked him to choose a final date. Perhaps he had never truly intended to leave when we discussed traveling and quiet mornings. That thought hurt more than I expected. It was not only that he had kept a promise from me. It was that he had allowed me to build a future around a decision he may never have planned to make. That evening, Martin returned home carrying a blue folder I had never seen before. He placed it on the small desk in our bedroom and immediately locked the drawer. I watched from the doorway. What is in the folder? School documents. You have an office for school documents. They are personal. Related to Eli? Martin's shoulders lowered. Please. The word was quiet, almost pleading. I wanted to push harder. Instead, I walked away. That was how the following months began. Not with one dramatic confrontation, but with an accumulation of incomplete answers. I learned that Eli was a senior. I learned that he arrived at school before 7 most mornings. I learned that Martin had begun meeting him in the library twice a week, even though Martin's first class did not begin until 8:15. I learned that the faculty meetings on Thursday afternoons were often not faculty meetings at all. I learned that Martin had been helping Eli write college essays, complete scholarship applications, and study for classes Martin did not even teach. I also learned that the diagnosis had not made Martin less secretive about the situation. It had made him more urgent. He began keeping a calendar in the locked desk drawer. I saw dates circled in red. Application deadlines, a financial aid workshop, a counseling appointment, a spring graduation rehearsal. Each event was weeks or months away, yet Martin treated everyone as an unbreakable obligation. Meanwhile, his body continued to remind both of us that the future did not care about his schedule. In December, he fell in the school parking lot. He told me he had slipped on ice, but there had been no ice that day. The temperature had remained above freezing. A colleague drove him home. His left palm was scraped, one knee was bruised, and his pride seemed more injured than either. I cleaned the cut at our kitchen sink. You cannot keep doing this, I said. It was one fall. It will not be the last. You don't know that. Neither do you. He winced as I pressed antiseptic against his hand. I am being careful. You are leaving before sunrise, coming home after dark, skipping physical therapy appointments, and pretending your body is not changing. I missed one appointment. You missed 3. Martin said nothing. Is Eli worth losing your health? His face tightened. That is not a fair question. No, it isn't. None of this is fair. He has until June. And what if you cannot make it until June? The question hung between us. Martin looked at his injured hand. I will. You cannot promise that. I already did. There it was again. The promise. Not to me. Not to our daughters. Not to himself. To a dead woman and a boy I had never met. I hated the resentment I felt toward them. I knew nothing about Marissa beyond her name. I knew nothing about Eli beyond a handwritten note and a collection of deadlines. Yet their invisible presence had begun to occupy our kitchen, our bedroom, our medical decisions, and every conversation about the future. Martin had made them part of our marriage without giving me permission to understand who they were. By Christmas, our daughters noticed the tension. Emily asked me privately whether Martin was frightened about retirement. Kate asked whether the medication was making him irritable. I protected him. I said the diagnosis had been difficult and we were adjusting. I did not mention Eli. I did not mention Marissa. Keeping Martin's secret made me feel complicit in my own exclusion. On Christmas morning, he gave me a new suitcase. It was beautiful, expensive, and exactly the size I had once said would be ideal for our planned autumn trip through Vermont. I stared at it beneath the tree. Martin smiled uncertainly. For next year, he said. Will there be a next year? The smile disappeared. Our daughters were in the kitchen making coffee. I kept my voice low. You refuse to sign the papers. You will not tell me what happens after June. You expect me to keep planning a life around decisions you make alone. I am retiring after graduation. You have not said that before. I am saying it now. Why should I believe you? Because I have never lied to you. You have allowed me to believe things that were not true. That is not the same. It feels the same from where I am standing. Martin looked toward the kitchen, making sure our daughters could not hear. I am trying to understand whether there will be anything left of you when you do. He lowered himself slowly into the armchair beside the tree. For the first time since the diagnosis, he looked old to me, not because of the tremor or the stiffness, because of the sadness in his face. I don't know how to leave him, he said. The anger inside me paused. You are his teacher. I am the last person who promised to stay. Then help me understand. Martin's eyes filled, but he shook his head. Not yet. He turned away before I could see whether he was crying. In January, I found Marissa's photograph. It was tucked inside an old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the bookshelf in Martin's study. I had pulled the book down because our granddaughter needed a copy for school. When I opened it, a photograph slipped between the pages and landed face up on the rug. The picture was nearly 20 years old. A young woman stood outside Bellwether High wearing a blue graduation gown. She looked no older than 18. Her dark hair was pulled back, and she was laughing at someone outside the frame. Beside her stood Martin. He was younger, thinner, and wearing a tie I remembered buying him during the first years of our marriage. The date on the back confirmed it. We had been married 12 years when the photograph was taken. Below the date, someone had written, "You were the only one who didn't let me disappear, Marissa." I sat on the rug holding the photograph for a long time. There was nothing romantic in the image. No physical closeness. No secret glance. Martin stood with the slightly formal posture teachers adopt beside students in photographs. But there was intimacy in the message. Not romantic intimacy. Something more difficult to categorize. You were the only one who didn't let me disappear. I thought of Eli's note. People always say they are not leaving before they do. The pattern was becoming clearer, but clarity did not yet equal understanding. That night, I placed the photograph on Martin's dinner plate. He entered the dining room, saw it, and stopped. I was looking for a book, I said. He sat across from me. I know what you think. I don't think I know enough to think anything. Martin touched the edge of the photograph with his left index finger. She was 17 when she became pregnant. I waited. Her parents told her she had embarrassed the family. Her father packed her clothes into garbage bags and left them on the porch. Where did she go? Different places, friends' houses, a shelter for a while. She stopped coming to school. And you found her? Our attendance secretary had an address for the shelter. I went there. You never told me. I couldn't discuss a student's situation. That was 20 years ago. Martin looked at the photograph. She came back, finished the year, graduated 2 months after Eli was born. You helped her. A lot of people helped her. But she wrote this to you. I was the one who kept showing up. The sentence struck me because it sounded so simple. I was the one who kept showing up. What happened after graduation? She worked, took community college classes, became a nurse eventually. And you stayed in contact. She sent a holiday card most years, occasionally an email. When did you meet Eli? When he was a baby, then not again until he entered Bellwether. You recognized him? I recognized the name. And Marissa? Martin's mouth tightened. She came to see me 3 years ago. I did not speak. She had cancer, he continued. It had already spread by the time they found it. The room seemed to grow quieter. How long did she have? Doctors thought perhaps a year. She lived 9 months. I looked again at the laughing girl in the photograph. What did she ask you to do? Martin rubbed his thumb against the side of his forefinger, a gesture he had begun using when the tremor worsened. She said Eli was angry. Missing school. Fighting. Her sister had agreed to take him, but the relationship was difficult. Marissa was afraid he would drop out after she died. And she asked you to tutor him? She asked me not to let him disappear. The words from the photograph returned. You were the only one who didn't let me disappear. Martin continued before I could answer. She said he trusted very few adults. She asked whether, if he transferred to Bellwether, I would check on him, not treat him differently, not make him feel like a charity case. Just make sure someone noticed whether he came through the door. And you promised you would. Yes. Did you promise not to retire? Not then. Martin stood and walked to the locked drawer. He opened it with a small key from his pocket and removed the blue folder. For months I had wondered what it contained. He carried it to the table and placed it between us. Inside were attendance records, copies of school-approved mentoring forms, college brochures, scholarship applications, and several letters. The first letter was from Marissa. Her handwriting was weaker than the message on the photograph, the lines uneven, as though writing itself had required effort. Mr. Hayes, I know this is too much to ask. I also know you are probably the only person I can ask without worrying that you will make him feel broken. Eli does not need another person feeling sorry for him. He needs someone stubborn enough to notice when he pretends not to care. You did that for me. I am not asking you to save him. I know better than anyone that people have to decide for themselves whether to keep going. I am asking you to be there long enough for him to make that decision. Martin let me read in silence. The second letter had been written several months later. Thank you for showing him the classroom before his first day. He pretended it did not matter, which means it mattered more than he will ever admit. He told me you still keep granola bars in your desk. Some things never change. The final letter was unfinished. Eli's aunt had found it among Marissa's belongings after her death and given it to Martin. The last readable sentence said, "Please don't let my leaving become proof that everyone leaves." I covered my mouth. Martin stared at the tabletop. After she died, Eli stopped speaking to me for almost 2 months, he said. He came to school, sat in the back, turned in nothing, and left. I kept putting work on his desk, kept saying good morning, kept the granola bars where he could see them. When did he start trusting you? Slowly. Martin removed another paper. It was the note I had found in his briefcase, but beneath it was a second page I had never seen. Eli had written again. I'm sorry about the other note. I know you're sick. People talk. I heard someone say you might retire. You don't have to stay because of me. But if you do stay, I think I can finish. Martin's voice was barely above a whisper. That was the week before my diagnosis. I looked at him. The retirement office had already sent the forms, he continued. I was going to sign them. Then the neurologist confirmed what was happening, and everyone assumed the diagnosis would be the reason I left immediately. Everyone, including me. Yes, but you had already decided not to leave. I had decided to stay until June. Because Eli said he thought he could finish if you stayed. Because I had told his mother I would be there long enough for him to decide whether he wanted a different life. You did not promise her your health. No. You did not promise her your marriage. Martin flinched. No. You could have told me. I know. Why didn't you? He looked toward the window. Outside, snow had begun to gather along the dark edges of the yard. I was afraid you would ask me to retire. I did ask you to retire. I was afraid you would be right. The honesty of that answer disarmed me. Martin continued. You would have made a reasonable argument. The doctor would have supported you. Emily and Kate would have supported you. Everyone would have told me I had already done enough. You had. That was the problem. I don't understand. I knew I had done enough by any reasonable standard. I had taught for almost 4 decades. I had helped Marissa. I had mentored Eli for 2 years. No one would have blamed me for leaving. But you would have blamed yourself. Martin nodded. And I was afraid that explaining it would make the promise sound noble. I did not want admiration. I did not want anyone telling Eli that I was sacrificing something for him. He has spent his entire life feeling like a burden people eventually set down. So you decided to carry everything alone. I thought that was the only way to keep him from feeling responsible. And what about me? Martin's eyes closed. I know. No, Martin. I need you to hear the question. What about me? He opened his eyes again. You let me believe you were choosing a building over your health. You let me wonder whether there was a woman, a son, a debt, or some life I had never known about. You asked me to trust you while giving me nothing to hold. I am sorry. I would have helped. I know that now. You should have known it then. He nodded. We sat together for a long time. I wish I could tell you that the truth erased my anger immediately. It did not. Understanding why Martin had stayed did not change the fact that he had excluded me from a decision affecting both our lives. His motive was compassionate. His silence was still harmful. Both things were true. That night we talked until nearly 2 in the morning. Martin told me about Eli's first year at Bellwether. He told me about the fights, the absences, and the afternoon Eli had torn an essay into pieces because Martin wrote that the work showed potential. He thought I was mocking him, Martin said. No one had used that word about him sincerely before. He told me about Marissa's funeral. Eli had stood beside the casket with his hands in his pockets, refusing to cry while relatives whispered that the shock had made him numb. Martin recognized the expression because he had seen it years earlier on Marissa's face whenever adults discussed her pregnancy as though she were not in the room. He told me about the first time Eli asked for help. It had not been with schoolwork. His aunt's car had broken down and he needed a ride to the cemetery on his mother's birthday. Martin arranged it through the school's mentoring program and sat on a bench while Eli remained beside the grave for nearly an hour. He told me about the first college brochure Eli picked up, then threw away when he learned the application fee. Martin retrieved it from the trash. He told me about the days Eli came to school angry, exhausted, or hungry. He told me about the days he did not come at all, and the calls Martin made to the attendance office before anyone could let the absence become a pattern. Slowly, the invisible boy who had occupied our marriage became a person. Eli liked astronomy but hated algebra. He worked evenings at a grocery store. He wrote beautifully when he stopped trying to sound as though nothing mattered. He wanted to study social work, though he was embarrassed to admit it because he feared people would say he was only interested in repairing a childhood that could not be repaired. He kept every note Marissa had ever left in his lunchbox. He had already been accepted to a state university, but the scholarship decision would not arrive until March, and he had no one he trusted enough to believe would still be sitting in the audience when he graduated. "Let me meet him," I said. Martin shook his head immediately. "No." "Why?" "He will think I told you because I feel sorry for him." "You did tell me, because I nearly destroyed our marriage by refusing to." "Then tell him that." Martin looked uncertain. "I am not asking to question him. I am not asking to become part of some dramatic rescue. Invite him for dinner." "He will say no." "Invite him anyway." Eli came to our house 2 weeks later. He arrived 20 minutes early and waited in his aunt's car until the exact time Martin had given him. I watched through the kitchen window as he climbed out carrying a grocery store bakery pie inside a clear plastic container. He was tall, thin, and dressed more formally than the dinner required. His shoulders were slightly rounded, as though he had learned to make himself occupy less space. Martin met him at the door. For the first several minutes, Eli barely looked at me. He called me Mrs. Hayes. He thanked me for dinner before he had eaten it. He placed the pie on the counter and apologized because it was not homemade. During the meal, I asked ordinary questions. What classes did he like? Did he follow sports? Had he always lived in the area? His answers were brief but polite. Martin did not force conversation. He allowed silence to settle without rushing to fill it, the same way he had done the night we first met. After dinner, Eli noticed the telescope near the living room window. It belonged to our daughter Emily originally, but Martin had kept it after she moved away. "You use that?" Eli asked. "Not well," I said. "Martin can find the moon. Everything else is optimism." For the first time that evening, Eli smiled. Martin showed him the telescope. Within minutes, the two of them were discussing constellations, light pollution, and a science project Eli had abandoned because he could not afford the materials. He spoke differently with Martin. Not warmly, exactly. Safely. There was a difference. Before leaving, Eli helped Martin carry the empty dishes into the kitchen. When Martin's hand trembled and one plate tilted, Eli steadied it without reacting. He did not stare. He did not offer pity. He simply adjusted his grip and continued walking. At the front door, he looked at me directly for the first time. "Thank you for dinner." "You are welcome anytime." He glanced toward Martin. "He told you about my mom." "Yes." Eli's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't supposed to make it a sad story. He didn't. It usually becomes one. "I think it is a story about someone who worked very hard to make sure you had a chance." He looked down. "She did. And I think Martin is trying to honor that. He doesn't have to stay at school because of me." "I know." "Oh, I told him that." "I read your note." Eli's expression closed immediately. I realized I had made a mistake. "I wasn't searching through his things," I said quickly. "But I did read it, and I am sorry. It belonged to you." He remained silent. Then he looked at Martin. "You should retire." Martin smiled faintly. "After June." "You say that now." "I signed the papers yesterday." I turned toward him. He had not told me. Martin reached into the pocket of his cardigan and handed me a copy of the retirement confirmation. His final day would be the Friday after graduation. Eli stared at the date. "You really signed it?" "Yes." "And you're still staying until then?" "Yes." "Why?" Martin looked at him with an expression I will never forget. "Because leaving at the right time is different from disappearing." Eli's eyes filled. He turned away quickly, pretending to examine the doorframe. Then he nodded once and left. From that evening forward, the promise was no longer something Martin carried entirely alone. I began attending his medical appointments. Not simply sitting beside him, but insisting that we ask the difficult questions he preferred to avoid. We arranged physical therapy after school on days he did not tutor. The principal reduced his supervision duties and moved his classroom closer to the faculty entrance. Martin protested every accommodation. Then he accepted them. I helped organize scholarship deadlines at our kitchen table. I'd proofread Eli's essays without changing his voice. When he needed tax information from an aunt who repeatedly forgot to provide it, I helped him make a checklist and sit through the financial aid phone line. None of this made me his mother. None of it replaced Marissa. That was important. Eli did not need replacement parents. He needed adults willing to remain consistent without claiming ownership over the life he was building. In March, the scholarship letter arrived. Eli did not open it at school. He brought it to our house. The three of us sat at the same kitchen table where the unsigned retirement papers had once remained for 19 days. Eli placed the envelope in front of him. "You open it," Martin said. "You do it. It has your name on it. That doesn't mean I have to be the one." I slid a letter opener across the table. Eli looked at it, then laughed nervously. "This feels stupid." "It is not stupid," I said. "It is just an envelope." "No," Martin replied. "It is several years of work pretending to be an envelope." Eli opened it. He had received enough financial support to attend without taking on the debt he had feared. For several seconds he read silently. Then he handed the letter to Martin. Martin's hands were trembling too much to hold the paper steadily, so I placed my hand beneath his. The three of us read the same paragraph together. Eli did not cry. He exhaled, folded forward, and covered his face with both hands. Martin reached across the table but stopped before touching him. Eli noticed. He moved his hand slightly across the table. Martin placed his own hand over it. That was all. The months leading to graduation were not easy. Parkinson's did not pause because Martin had found a meaningful reason to continue working. Some mornings were better than others. On difficult days, it took him almost an hour to dress. His voice occasionally became softer by the end of the school day. His handwriting grew smaller. Fatigue settled over him more heavily, especially after long weeks. There were evenings when I wondered whether staying had been a mistake. There were evenings when Martin wondered too. In April, he froze briefly in a crowded hallway, unable to initiate the next step while students moved around him. Another teacher guided him to a chair. When the principal called me, I drove to the school expecting the argument that would finally end his career immediately. Instead, I found Martin sitting in his classroom with Eli beside him. Eli was reading aloud from a college orientation packet. He looked up when I entered. "He's okay," Eli said. Martin gave him a tired smile. "I am capable of answering for myself." "You were not answering. I was resting. You were pretending to rest." Their exchange sounded so ordinary that I almost laughed. Then I saw the fear in Martin's face. He had hidden it from Eli, but not from me. I took him home. That evening I placed the retirement papers, already signed and processed, on the table again. "You do not have to prove anything," I told him. "I know. If you stop now, you have not failed him." "I know. Then tell me honestly, do you still want to finish?" Martin considered the question for a long time. "Yes." "Because of the promise?" "Partly." "What is the other part?" He looked at his trembling hand. "Because I need to leave as a teacher, not as a diagnosis." I understood. That answer was different from denial. He was not pretending Parkinson's did not exist. He was asking for the chance to choose the final shape of a life the disease had begun changing without his permission. "Then we finish carefully," I said. He nodded. "We created rules. No more driving to school alone, no missed therapy, no late evenings unless another teacher remained with him. If he fell again, experienced another freezing episode, or the neurologist advised him to stop, he would stop." Martin agreed. This time, he kept the agreement. Graduation arrived on a warm Friday evening in June. Martin woke before the alarm. His body was stiff, and his right hand trembled badly enough that he could not fasten the buttons on his white shirt. I buttoned it for him. He stood in front of our bedroom mirror wearing the navy suit he had worn to nearly every graduation for the previous 15 years. The jacket hung more loosely than it once had. He adjusted his tie with his left hand. "You look handsome," I said. "I look nervous." "You have attended 37 graduations. Not this one." At Bellwether High, rows of folding chairs covered the football field. Families carried flowers, balloons, and signs with students' names. The faculty sat near the stage in black gowns and colored academic hoods. Eli's aunt had promised to attend. She did not. 10 minutes before the ceremony, the seat he had reserved for her remained empty. I watched him notice. He was standing with the other seniors near the field entrance. His eyes moved across the crowd once, then again. His expression did not change, but his shoulders lowered slightly. I stood and waved. At first he did not see me. Then Martin raised his left hand from the faculty section. Eli found him. He looked back toward me. I pointed to the 2 empty seats beside me and then toward him, trying to communicate across the distance that absence did not mean he was alone. His shoulders lifted again. The ceremony began. Names were called one by one. Students crossed the stage while families shouted, applauded, and cried. Martin sat upright, though I could see the effort it required. His cane rested beside his chair. When Eli's row stood, Martin reached for it. He rose slowly. The teacher beside him offered an arm. Martin accepted. Eli's name was called. He walked across the stage. The applause around me became indistinct. I watched his face. He accepted the diploma holder from the principal, shook hands, and turned toward the stairs. Then he looked directly at Martin. Martin was standing. Not steadily, not easily, but standing. Eli pressed one hand against his own heart. Martin did the same. It lasted only a second. Most people in the audience probably did not notice. To me, it felt like the entire reason we were there. After the ceremony, families crowded the field taking photographs. Eli stood alone near the goalpost, holding his diploma. Martin and I approached him. "You made it," Martin said. Eli looked at the diploma, then back at him. "You stayed." I said I would. Eli swallowed. "I kept thinking something would happen." "Something did happen," Martin replied. "You graduated." "That's not what I meant." "I know." Eli reached inside his gown and removed a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this before my mom died. She made me write down 3 things I wanted to do, even though I told her it was stupid." He handed the paper to Martin. The handwriting was younger than the notes I had seen. "Finish high school. Go somewhere nobody knows me as the kid whose mom died. Become the person someone calls when they don't know what to do." Martin read the list. "You have completed the first one," he said. Eli nodded. "2 more." "More than 2, Martin said. "Never stop adding to the list." A photographer nearby called for graduates to gather with their families. Eli looked toward the crowd, then at us. "Can we take a picture?" "Of course," I said. He hesitated. "All 3 of us." Martin's eyes filled immediately. "Yes," he said. "All 3." We stood together beneath the fading evening light. Eli was in the middle. Martin held his cane in one hand and placed the other lightly against Eli's back. I stood on Eli's opposite side. Before the photographer took the picture, Eli said something quietly. "My mom would have liked this." Martin closed his eyes for a moment, then the camera flashed. The following Monday, Martin returned to Bellwether High for the last time as a teacher. I went with him. His classroom had already begun to look unfamiliar. Posters had been removed. Books were stacked in boxes. The desk drawers stood open and mostly empty. Martin walked slowly around the room. He touched the edge of the chalkboard. He removed a photograph of our daughters from his desk. He placed the leather briefcase on the chair and sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. "Do you regret staying?" I asked. Martin considered it. "I regret not telling you." "That was not my question." "No," he said. "I do not regret staying." "Do you regret retiring?" He smiled. "Ask me after the first Monday in September." We carried the boxes to the car together. Before leaving, Martin placed one final object inside the top drawer of the desk. A box of granola bars. "For the next teacher?" I asked. "For whoever notices." Retirement did not solve everything. The diagnosis remained. There were appointments, medication adjustments, exercises, and days when Martin's frustration filled the entire house. There were also quiet mornings, long walks, afternoons with our grandchildren, and the Vermont trip we had postponed. We traveled in October. The leaves were brighter than either of us expected. Martin's steps were slow, but they were still his. Eli called every Sunday during his first semester at university. At first, the calls were mostly for Martin. Then he began asking to speak with me too. He struggled during the first months. He considered leaving after failing an exam. He hated his roommate. He worried that everyone around him was better prepared and more certain. Martin did not solve those problems. He listened. Sometimes, that was still the most important thing he knew how to do. At Christmas, Eli came home carrying the same clear plastic bakery container he had brought to our first dinner. This time, the pie was homemade. It leaned slightly to one side, and the crust was too dark around the edges, but he placed it on the counter with visible pride. After dinner, he handed Martin an envelope. Inside was a card. You kept your promise to my mother. You kept your promise to me. Now I'm making one to you. You don't face what comes next alone. Martin read the message twice. Then he handed it to me because his hands had begun to shake. I held the card while he cried. I think often about the months before I knew the truth. I think about the unsigned papers on our kitchen table, the late evenings, the locked drawer, and the note that turned a student's private fear into my own. I think about how easily love can become distorted when it is carried in silence. Martin believed that protecting Eli required excluding me. He believed that explaining the promise would turn the boy into a burden or make Martin's decision look like a sacrifice. He believed that if he kept everyone separated, he could protect them all. Instead, he frightened me, exhausted himself, and nearly damaged the very marriage that could have helped him keep the promise more safely. A noble reason does not make secrecy harmless. That is something both of us had to learn. But I learned something else too. Sometimes a person's refusal to leave is not stubbornness. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is pride. And sometimes it is the memory of a dying woman asking one final question of the only adult who had once proven he knew how to stay. Martin did not continue teaching because we needed the money. He did not continue because he believed himself indispensable. He knew the school would survive without him. He knew another teacher could help Eli with essays. He knew decades of service had earned him the right to rest. He stayed because Eli had spent his life watching adults become temporary. His father had disappeared before he was old enough to remember him. His grandparents had died. Relatives had offered rooms but not always permanence. Then the one person who had fought hardest to remain, his mother, had been taken by illness. Martin understood that retiring before graduation would have been reasonable. He also understood that to Eli, reason would not change the pattern. One more adult would have said, "I care about you," and then vanished before the ending. Martin wanted to prove that endings could be different. He wanted Eli to see someone leave openly, honestly, and at the promised time. Not in the middle, not without explanation, not before the boy had crossed the stage. That was why he signed the retirement papers only after telling Eli the exact date. That was why his final day came after graduation rather than before it. And that was why his words at our front door mattered so much. Leaving at the right time is different from disappearing. I wish Martin had trusted me with the truth sooner. I wish I had not spent months wondering whether a secret child, hidden debt, or old relationship stood between us. I wish compassion automatically made people honest. It does not. Good people can keep damaging secrets for reasons they believe are selfless. Loyal people can become so focused on keeping one promise that they overlook the promises already woven into their daily lives. A marriage cannot survive indefinitely on requests for blind trust. Trust needs something to stand on. It needs context, conversation, and the humility to admit when protecting someone else's privacy has become an excuse for avoiding your own vulnerability. Martin understands that now. So do I. 3 years have passed since that graduation. Martin's Parkinson's has progressed, though more slowly than we feared during those first frightening weeks. He uses a cane more regularly. His voice is softer. Some mornings take longer. He still tutors one afternoon a week at the public library. I drive him. He no longer pretends this arrangement is temporary or unnecessary. Eli is completing his degree in social work. He says he wants to work with teenagers who have become experts at pretending they do not need anyone. The photograph from graduation sits on our living room bookshelf. All 3 of us are facing the camera. Eli is holding his diploma. Martin's hand rests against his back. Every time I look at it, I think about the photograph of Marissa in her blue graduation gown, taken 2 decades earlier. 2 students, 2 graduations, 1 teacher who kept showing up. Last spring, Eli visited Bellwether High during a break from university. The principal invited Martin too. Together they spoke to a small group of students who were considering dropping out. Martin did not give an inspirational speech. That was never his way. He told them that finishing something did not mean completing it perfectly. It meant returning often enough that the unfinished thing could no longer convince you it was impossible. Then Eli stood. He told them there had been a time when he believed every adult promise came with an invisible expiration date. He looked at Martin as he said it. Then one person stayed until the exact day he said he would leave. Afterward, a student approached Martin privately. I watched from across the room as Martin leaned forward, listening with the same complete attention that first drew me to him 36 years earlier. The student spoke for several minutes. Martin did not interrupt. When the conversation ended, he handed the student a granola bar from his coat pocket. Some things never change, others change completely. I no longer see retirement as the day Martin stopped being a teacher. I see it as the day he finally allowed the people who loved him to help carry what teaching had asked of him. I no longer see his diagnosis only as something that took from us. It also forced open a truth he might otherwise have kept hidden until the damage became impossible to repair. And I no longer see the unsigned retirement packet as evidence that my husband chose someone else over our future. I see it as evidence of a man caught between two forms of love, trying imperfectly to honor both, and eventually learning that he never needed to choose between them in the first place. There was room at our kitchen table for the diagnosis. There was room for our marriage. There was room for Marissa's memory. There was room for Eli's fear. There was even room, eventually, for retirement. The mistake was believing that any of those things had to remain hidden in order for the others to survive. If you are living beside someone who refuses to explain a decision affecting both your lives, remember that patience does not require silence forever. Ask the difficult question. Ask it again if the first answer is incomplete. Compassion for another person's private pain should not require abandoning your own need for honesty. And if you are the person carrying a promise alone, consider whether secrecy is truly protecting the people involved, or whether it is protecting you from the fear of being questioned, misunderstood, or asked to change course. The people who love you may not agree with every decision. They may challenge you, but they may also become the reason you are able to keep the promise without destroying yourself in the process. Martin stayed until graduation. Eli finished. The school year ended, the retirement papers were signed, and the future I once believed Martin was refusing finally began. Not the version we had planned before the diagnosis, but a slower, more honest version built around the truth of who we had become. Some mornings, Martin and I sit together at the kitchen table where those papers once waited. He drinks coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup. I read while he watches birds through the window. There is no bell schedule, no stack of essays, no reason to hurry. On the wall beside the table are two framed photographs, Marissa in her graduation gown, Eli in his. Between them is the card he gave Martin at Christmas. You don't face what comes next alone. That promise belongs to all of us now. And unlike the promise that nearly divided our marriage, this one was spoken aloud.